everyone, and welcome to The Apex, a weekly conversation with the titans and tastemakers of the automotive world. If you've ever tried to get just a bit faster on track, or if you spend your time looking for ways to squeeze the very last tenths of a second from your race car, you'll be excited to hear from our guest this week, performance coach, racing driver, and accomplished author Ross Bentley. Ross is well known in the performance driving world for his series of books and podcasts entitled Speed Secrets, which have inspired scores of driving enthusiasts to better their own performance. He joins us today to talk about his career and all things fast driving. Ross, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Hector. You twisted my arm and forced me into talking about driving here. So,
yeah. I know it's tough. So, first question is: could you tell us a bit about your first experiences with cars and how you eventually got into competitive motor racing?
Well, I guess like many drivers, I blame my dad. My father took me to a race when I was 5 years old, and apparently that night I told my mom and my dad, and I said, "I'm going to be a race car driver." And, when you're 5 years old, you're going to be what? A fireman, an astronaut, or a race car driver, right? And fortunately, I never grew up. I stayed a 5-year-old most of my life. And here I am almost 60 years later, still playing this race car driver thing. And mostly, obviously a race driver coach now, but that's kind of how I got into it. And then it just, going to the track, my father worked on race cars, built race cars, mostly oval track, like sprint cars, super modifieds, that kind of thing in America and in Canada, where I'm born and from. And so I would just be at the track most weekends helping my dad, pretending to be a mechanic on the car. And then when it got to that age where I could finally go and start racing, I'll tell you the very quick story was I also played a lot of tennis as a kid. And for a while thought, I'm going to make it as a tennis pro. And then found out that I couldn't afford to compete with competitors, tennis players who had wealthier families who could afford to have them have tennis lessons all day long. Mm-hmm. So I decided I couldn't afford to play tennis. So naturally, I went racing.
Of course. It's the natural progression.
Which just proves my mental capacity for math and budgets and things like that, at least. So, yeah.
And some would say ambition. And so you ended up, your professional career was really in IndyCar mostly, was it? And then later sports cars?
My goal ever since I was a little kid was I wanted to go and race the Indy 500 and drive Indy cars. Obviously, there was a time where Formula One was it. But as a Canadian living in Vancouver, kind of in that West Coast up in the corner of North America, access to, it's not the hotbed of motorsport. And, so there was a point there where I thought, Formula One, go to Europe, all that kind of stuff. And it just, you could kind of see that wasn't going to work. And IndyCar had been such a big part of my childhood and watching the Indy 500 and things that's where I wanted to go. I got to the point where I drove for the smallest budgeted team in IndyCar racing, probably in history, compared to everybody else. And had some good runs, but, really struggled with old equipment and things. But fortunately, it opened the door for sports car teams and contacted me. And, I'll never forget the day when a sports car team called me and said, "Hey, we want you to go to Sebring and go testing our prototype car for 3 days. And this is what we're going to pay you." And that was pay me? Like, really? I'm actually going to get paid to go and do this? And, for 3 days, I literally drove that car with laughing inside my helmet thinking, man, I'm getting paid to drive sports cars. And, while everything else up to them was kind of piecing deals together, this was purely all I had to do was show up and drive. And so made that switch to racing in IMSA, American Le Mans Series, whatever they changed it to every 3 years, it seemed like. So, and had a nice career driving sports cars.
Cool. And so a lot of people will know you through your Speed Secrets books. I think the first one of which was published in 1998. When did you start coaching and how did the idea for writing those books come about?
Well, I guess to take it back a little ways, the very first thing I did in racing, I went to a Jim Russell school that was at Willow Springs Raceway in California, when I was, whatever it was, 18 or 19 or something like that. And when I finished the school, they said, hey, do you want to stay here and become an instructor? And that kind of just, it had never, that was like the weirdest thought in my head. Really? Teach this stuff? And one of the instructors pulled me aside and said, don't do it. If you want to go racing, go racing. Don't get stuck here in the school instructing. But it planted a little seed of, oh, that would be kind of cool too, to teach this. So as part of, like every race car driver, you're always, not always, you're often poorly funded. So you're looking for side jobs and gigs and things like that. And I found that teaching drivers and helping them learn what I've learned was at times as rewarding as driving a race car. So I started doing that, I guess, through the 90s. I'd started a school at the local racetrack in Vancouver, Westwood, which no longer is there, and had started a school there. And basically just each year would write a little bit of a kind of a guide, handbook, tool to hand out to students. And it kind of kept growing, and it grew and it grew. And then when I was racing Indy cars, after every race, I would just write all my thoughts, everything that I learned. How does that apply to other drivers? And eventually it sort of became this big, huge document that I gave to a friend of mine who was a journalist. And he said, I'm going to send this to the publisher at Motor Books International. And he sent it there, and they came back and said, we want to publish this. And I'm pretty sure that in high school, I was probably voted the least likely person to ever write anything in their life. And yet they ended up publishing this book. And I also went through a period of time in Vancouver writing for the local newspaper, sort of driving tips for the average person.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So for 4 or 5 years, every single week, I had to write a 1,000-word column.
Oh, wow.
And it forced me to learn how to write. And it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, I think. So the combination of that and, they published that book. And then by the time it was finished, I was thinking, it's incomplete. We need to do something about the mental game. And then, so me and another co-author wrote that. And then it kind of just kept growing from there. And I find that what I love to do when I'm on airplanes, which I spend half my life on, is write. And it's a great sort of, I actually just read a fantastic quote the other day, and it said, if you think you can learn things by reading books, you ought to try writing one. And I was like, that is it. The reason I write is to clarify my thinking. And everybody who I've ever written anything and who's read anything I've written, I have to thank them for helping me learn by doing that.
That's really interesting. I wasn't actually aware that the Speed Secrets books were kind of written almost like a kind of fresh day-to-day, off the track kind of process. That's really interesting. So I wanted to ask you were talking about driving coaches. What are the signs of a good driving coach? Before we start to talk about, performance driving, are all fast drivers able to teach, or have you found that teaching someone how to be fast is a skill in itself that maybe not everyone has?
Well, there's a couple of things, and maybe answering your second question first is, being a fast driver, does that make you a good coach? Not necessarily. I know some incredibly fast drivers who are terrible coaches. They don't really understand what they do, and they're not able to communicate what they do or what somebody should do. So just being a fast driver isn't necessarily a good thing. Having experience is a benefit as a coach. If you've got very, very little experience driving a race car, that's a downside because it's hard for you to relate. It's hard for you to understand. It's hard to even have empathy for the driver. So having some level of experience, but it doesn't need to be at the highest level. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to have won world championships to be a great coach. And I think, if you look at the great coaches in every sport, most of the best coaches weren't necessarily the best player or the best athlete in those sports. And in terms of kind of what makes a great coach, I think that the first thing that comes to mind is you have to be a great learner. And I think, be a great teacher, you have to be a great learner. You have to be passionate about, I want to learn, I want to soak up everything I can. And, I know certainly when I kind of made the decision that coaching is going to become a profession, not something I do on the side, then, I spent every waking hour learning, teaching myself, getting experience, going through courses on how to be a great coach in many different areas that then I could relate to motorsport. So I think the learning part, the other part of that, I think, and I touched on it, is it comes down to, I think, the motivation to be a coach. I want to be careful saying this, but there are a lot of underemployed race car drivers who call themselves coaches. And I don't think they're necessarily real coaches. They're doing the coaching job, but they're not necessarily there for the right reasons. I think the best coaches I know reached a point in their life where they went, I get as much of a thrill, as much of a kick, and I have as much passion about helping that person as I did about helping myself. And being a race car driver is a selfish business. You have to be selfish, hopefully not in a bad way, but in a good way. You've got to be, it's all about me driving the car. Yeah. And if that's the way you think as a coach, you're not going to be as successful as somebody else that says, no, it's all about you as a driver. And some people are not able to make that switch. So I think that motivation is critically important.
So that's some great insight there. And so let's talk about performance driving a bit. I know a lot of our listeners, especially given the pandemic, are now keen to go out and maybe do their first proper track day, or if they've done it before, maybe they're going to give their first proper race series a go. How should you approach those so that you can get the most out of it? What sort of mindset should people put themselves in?
Well, I'm a big believer and proponent of this, the whole idea of a growth mindset, the idea that we're always open to learning. Our brains are plastic, they can grow, they can improve. The thing that shocks me at times is the number of drivers that come to a track for their first time or their third time, and they have done very little homework. And nowadays it's so easy. Spend 20 minutes on Google, watch some YouTube video. Not all of them are perfect. Believe it or not, some things on YouTube are not great, but there is a lot of great stuff there. And, read some stuff. I've seen drivers come to the track and you mention the word apex and they're like, you can tell they don't really quite understand what that is, or understeer and oversteer. If somebody just spends a little time beforehand, our sport is so expensive for, the money you put in per lap is so expensive that why not make the most of every single lap? And a little bit of preparation will go a long, long way. So I think that's the first part. And then the second part is it related to that, or it's a continuation of that, is there are people out there, coaches, instructors, who live for the thrill of seeing you have that smile on your face when it clicks and that aha moment in the car, and they want to help you. So you use them and abuse them. No, reach out to them. And, sure, the sport is expensive and sometimes coaches, instructors are expensive as well in some ways. But what I can tell you is what you learn from a coach in a day will not wear out like a set of tires will. And
so just taking the mindset theme a bit further, how big a part does it play, and how big a part does your mentality play in performance driving? Where does it intersect with, I guess, what you'd call motor skills or your physical fitness? When you're out there on the track, how important is the mental game?
Well, I think it's massive. Coming from my background with a very low budget, it was one of the areas that I looked at early on in my career, because it was something that it doesn't cost a lot to work on your mind. Spending more money on the car or whatever else, I didn't have that. So I looked at that very early on. And also, I mean, all you really need to do is look around at athletes in every sport and you go, what is the difference? And 9 times out of 10, it's what's going on in their head. What makes Lewis Hamilton so good? Sure, his skills are incredibly well developed, but where does he store those skills? He stores them in his brain. So, and if he doesn't access them in the right time in the right way, he's not going to perform at his best. And one of the things that he does better than most, and some say all at times, is he accesses them on a more consistent basis better than anybody else. So that mental game is absolutely critically important. It tends to be not as focused on because I can sit here and I can talk to you about the line through a corner, and I could draw you a picture of the line through the corner. I can talk to you about understeer and oversteer and load transfer in the car and things, and they're all physical things that you can kind of touch or see pictures of. How do you see pictures of what's going on in your brain? It's hard to see. So it's harder to put your hands around and really work on it. But the drivers that do are the ones that consistently perform at their best.
Is there something there about getting into a kind of flow state? We had Stefan Johansson on here some interviews back. And when he described it, it was like, it was just pure focus. Everything just melts away. And I mean, even from our experiences, some of us did a 24-hour race karting recently. And what I remember is trying to explain what I was doing in the corner. I just couldn't find the words, but I could see the images running through my head from what I'd just been through.
Well, good old Steve Johnson, Stefan Johansson, yes, I think every driver that's been at that level, it is one of those things, they're better at explaining it because they've experienced it a lot more. And it's one of those things that if you've experienced it a few times, you go, I recognize it when I see it, but I don't know how to get there. And, part of my coaching is all around helping drivers get into that zone or flow more often. For sure, one way of describing it is, to me, it's a little bit like you're driving the car on autopilot. You're trusting your subconscious brain to drive the car. All of the programmed skills that you've developed over repetition, over time, over and over and over again, you no longer have to think about them in a conscious way. It's not like you're coming to the brake zone thinking, okay, at the 3 marker, I'm going to apply the brakes, and then I'm going to downshift, and then I'm going to downshift again, and then I'm going to ease off the brakes as I turn the wheel. You don't think that because you can't think consciously fast enough. But so you just rely on the programming that's in your brain to do that. And that's trusting your subconscious to do it. While your conscious mind is kind of sitting back, it's almost like, I think about it as having a camera looking over your shoulder and kind of watching what you're doing and going, oh, what if you braked 1 car length later here? What if you got turned in earlier here? What if you got back to power earlier here? What if you changed the way you line the car up here, making this pass? So your conscious mind is aware. So I describe it as you're driving the car on autopilot, trusting your subconscious, while your conscious mind is aware of everything that's around you to help you improve. Because if you didn't have that awareness, you would never improve. You would just drive. It's kind of like when, if you've ever driven from home to where you work or school or whatever, and you drove there and you went, I don't remember driving here. Well, that's the subconscious part. The conscious part is you're aware of what's going on around you. And when you get that right balance between the subconscious and the conscious, that's a big part of flow, big part of being in the zone.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting it. I think one of the things that really throws this into relief for me is this problematic issue, I think, that maybe slightly more experienced drivers have, which is overdriving, when you're trying too hard and your conscious and subconscious are in a bit of a fight because you need to pull the lap time out, but the more you try, the worse it gets. How do you stop doing that? How do you stop trying too hard?
Well, I'm a big believer in having triggers. meaning trigger words or phrases that trigger different programs. I mean, if you think about just about everything you do in your life, you do it the way you do because you're programmed to do it. You've got a mental program, the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you turn the steering wheel. And you've developed those programs through repetition. And there are certain things that trigger reactions, right? Somebody says something to you in a certain tone and you react in some kind of emotional way. And that's a trigger. Well, you can use those triggers in a very deliberate way. For example, I use the example of one of my trigger phrases is car dancing. To me, when I'm driving the car at the limit, in flow, in the zone, it's like I'm dancing with the car. We're moving together. We're flowing around the track. And it's a balance between, I'm not a dancer, by the way. But it's a balance between sort of a ballroom dance and a punk dance. Like there are times where you need to grab the car and grab it by the throat and make it do what you want. And other times where you need to just work with it and flow with it. And it's finding that right balance. And that balance changes. Sometimes depending on how the car is working and the type of track you're on, you might have to grab it by the scruff of the neck a little bit more. Other times you need to just relax with it a little bit more. So you're constantly trying to kind of balance those two. And for me, I just say the phrase car dancing and that triggers it for me. That's like my brain goes, boom, there I am. For other drivers, the trigger might be, smooth hands. It might be attack, So if you build sort of these trigger phrases or trigger words and you use them over and over and over again, and you practice them sort of in your mind beforehand so that when I need to grab the car and not necessarily try harder, but just push a little harder, it might be attack. And if it's other times where it's like I recognize I'm in the try mode a little bit too much, it might be a little bit of, just smooth hands. And you build these little trigger phrases so you have the ability to immediately in the moment dial that up and down to get the right balance at that moment in time. And one of my favorite trigger phrases that I use with a lot of drivers, mostly drivers who are they're too analytical, and they get in the car and they're thinking about where they brake and what's the data trace going to look like and how is my video working, and they're way too analytical about things. If I'm on the radio, and we've worked this out beforehand, so it's not a surprise. It is part of their trigger phrase. But I'll say, "Drive, stupid," meaning just turn your brain off and drive. And the very, very, very best drivers in the world, you can see them at times, especially during practice and qualifying, and leading up to the race, where they're very analytical. They're thinking about every last little detail. The Lewis Hamiltons, the Max Verstappen. They're very, very focused on the details up to a certain point, and then they just let go. And they go, okay, now it's just time for me just to drive, let my subconscious programming drive the car. And sometimes that phrase of just drive stupid works.
And so when that happens, what does that great fast lap feel like? Because I know what it doesn't feel like, which is a struggle, skidding, all of that stuff. And you bathed in sweat, you're like, oh, I'm Ayrton Senna. And then you look at the timesheet and you're like, you lost a second there. What were you doing?
Well, it's kind of magical, isn't it? When it's working. And I think this is important that drivers get clear of what does that really feel like and replay that feeling. First of all, I've never met a driver where I've asked that kind of a question where they didn't have this massive smile on their face. Like, first of all, you're having fun. It's not in a, fun jumping up and down and laughing kind of way, but it's enjoyable. And again, there's a balance between, it's not effortless as in you're cruising down the highway with one hand on the steering wheel kind of effortless, but it's not that try mode. It's, you feel confident that what's coming up ahead. It's almost like you can predict what's going to happen. It's you're focused, but not hyper focused. Meaning like you can you can zero in on the details, and yet you pick up stuff off to the side. You're aware of other cars around you. So you've kind of got this, again, a balance between being very focused and being sort of a broad focus. Time changes. It doesn't feel like you're rushed. Now, things can be happening quickly, but you don't feel rushed. You feel like sometimes you're in the car and you're just going, I've got all the time in the world. I'm just playing with this. Yeah. And maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's being that 5-year-old, you're playing with your little model cars in the mud, like you're just playing. And, but I also don't want to kind of go too woo-woo over here because again, at times you kind of got to grab the car. And I know drivers who are so caught up in this smooth is fast thing that they're smooth, but they're not quite really fast.
They might slow.
They might be okay fast, but they're not really fast. And sometimes you just need to, dial up that attack mode just a little bit more. And I think, again, where a guy like Lewis Hamilton is so great is that he can dial up his attack and be super attack mode, but he still kind of does it in a smooth, calm way.
Yeah.
And, that's pretty special, and not everybody's going to get to that level. But if you have that mental model in your brain, the likelihood of getting closer to it has gone way, way up.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. So maybe we can talk about the actual cars for a bit. You've raced a lot of machinery in your career, from IndyCar to prototypes, as we mentioned, the Ferrari 333 SP, factory BMW M3s, a whole lot of client cars, I'm sure, as well. What have been the standout machines for you? And was there a distinction between, some of the older classic racing stuff and the new hyper technologically advanced racing cars? What were your highlights?
Well, can I tell you what my favorite race car is?
Please do. Yeah.
The next one I drive.
So
interesting. I mean, first of all, as you said, the Ferrari 333 SP, just a beautiful, beautiful car. Driving that car that was kind of Ferrari's first coming back into prototype sports cars in the, late 90s. And I drove chassis number 3. Chassis 1 and 2 were prototypes at Ferrari that never got raced, my understanding. And I drove number 3. So that was pretty special. And the sound that V12 made was just incredible. So it was a beautiful, beautiful car, and I love driving that. Interestingly, when I think about all the cars I've driven, my first real race car that I drove was a Taiga Formula Ford, 1977, 77F Taiga Formula Ford. And probably, I guess it was maybe 7-8 years ago, I got to drive, it was actually a 79 Taiga at an event, just to go out and do some laps in it. And it's funny how, the gap in between was whatever, 30, 40 years, something like that. I can't remember what it was, but it was like a long period of time. But I felt like I was back home again. And the car felt kind of rattly and it, spindly and all that kind of stuff, but it just felt so good. And I guess, I don't know, once you love the feeling of driving a car, it doesn't really matter. Quick aside here is, each year, other than this past year, for obvious reasons, I take a group of drivers, myself and another fellow take a group of drivers from North America to the Nürburgring in Spa. And when I go over there, we have choices of driving cars from Porsche GT2 RSs, every kind of BMW, everything in between, Nissan GTRs and Renault Meganes. And people go, what's your favorite car? And I go, give me the Renault. And it's that I'd rather drive a slow car fast than a fast car slow. And we'll go to the Nürburgring. I hop at a GT3 RS or whatever, and you're leaving just that little margin because
Yeah.
it's not the most forgiving circuit in the world. And yet I drive the Renault and I drive it absolutely flat out. And I went out a few years ago to collect 2 laps for some data.
Mhm.
And I did 2 laps in a row, and they were 0.4 of a second apart around the Nordschleife.
Mhm.
And there's no way I could have done that in a super hyper fast car because I would have left a little margin here, a little margin there, and it would have ended up in being a big. This car, this Renault, I drove flat out.
Mhm.
There was nothing left. That was right up against it, and that was one of the most fun couple laps I've ever driven on a racetrack because I got out and went 0.4 of a second over whatever that was, a 9-minute lap or something.
Mhm.
I know there's nothing left. And that just felt so good. So I'm not quite, I'm sorry, Hector, if I kind of got off track of your original question there, but I think, of all the cars I've driven, it just, I've had as much fun in slower cars that are not as cool as a Ferrari 333 or an Indy car or the factory BMWs that I drove and stuff like that. But being able to just drive them well at the limit, it's a blast. And it's that magic that we talked about, I think.
So I guess to keep yourself sharp and learn new skills, as you say, you don't need a GT3 RS, although those are great cars. An MX-5 or I guess whatever you can run can teach you something.
Well, and there's certainly an argument for you should drive a car that you're willing to take to a cliff and push it off and say goodbye to it. You're going to learn more from that car than you are, a $200,000 car that you're like, oh, I got to drive around. Oh, I don't want to scratch this. I don't want to hurt this. Yeah. And the other part of that, I think, is cars with lower limits. It makes it easier for you to work at driving the limits. And I spent a few weeks back, I spent a week driving a Porsche GT3 RS at a variety of tracks in an event called One Lap of America, where you travel around the different tracks and drive. And it is just such a beautiful, awesome car. But the limits are so high that it's hard to get up there unless you're going to drive it. Unless you're racing that car and you can afford to race that car, it's tough for you to get to that limit all the time. So I'm a big believer in driving cars that have higher slip angles, so less sticky tires, and a car that will move around a little bit more because you get used to that sensation of what's the car doing and what is it telling you. So I'm a big believer in those kinds of cars. And a car that is maybe a little less forgiving, meaning like a GT3 RS is very forgiving. You make a little mistake, you just plant your foot a little harder in the throttle and you make up for it. You're in an MX-5, you make a little mistake, it'll take you 5 laps to gain that speed back again, So it teaches you more in that way. Yeah,
that's awesome. There's so much to think about there. So Ross, we're coming up on time, so I thought we'd end with some quick fire questions.
Sure.
And I've slightly crafted these for the driver coach in you. But I guess apart from this first one, which is, what is your greatest personal racing or driving memory?
Winning anything has been the highlight in terms of the driving part. Winning the Daytona 24-hour race in a car that we should not have won in was maybe the most satisfying. I'm not saying it was the greatest, but we won that race by being smarter, including me driving the last stint of the race with no brake lights, with the threat of being black flagged, but me, every single time I got to a brake zone, reaching up and turning the rain light on and then turning it off.
Oh my God.
Driving for an hour and a half, turning the rain light on and off to simulate the brake light, so we never got black flagged. And we won because of, if we had gotten black flagged, we would have lost. So that was very satisfying. I've had some amazing coaching experiences that are just as rewarding. There was one weekend, and I've had some amazing ones just recently, but one that kind of stands out a little bit is there was a weekend. I was actually at Le Mans coaching at Le Mans for a 3-driver team, obviously. One of them being a very, very famous actor who's been involved with sports car racing. I think a fellow named Patrick Dempsey. Somebody might have heard of him before. And I was there coaching 3 drivers, first time at Le Mans. Did they win? No, they didn't. Had a great event. But that weekend, one of the drivers that I'd coached since he was 12 years old, Colin Braun, was racing in NASCAR at the time. And in the early morning at Le Mans, I get a phone call, and it's Colin in Victory Lane at the Michigan International Speedway. He just won his first NASCAR race, and he was calling me from Victory Lane.
Wow.
And that afternoon, I had been working with a flat track motorcycle racer, slide the bike through on dirt on an oval.
Yeah.
Just totally mental game because I've never done that. And their big race of the year in the U.S. is called the Springfield Mile. So a 1 mile oval track on the dirt. And he called me saying that he just won, and by the biggest margin of victory in AMA, American Motorcycle Association history. And so on that one weekend, I'm at Le Mans and I'm getting calls from a NASCAR driver and a motorcycle racer that they won. And it's like, that was a pretty cool weekend.
Wow. Wow is all I can say. So second question is, and this is why I've slightly adjusted it for you. We usually ask what someone's favorite racetrack is, but as we've got Ross Bentley here, it's what are your top 3 racetracks?
Top 3 racetracks
in the world.
I've been asked this question in different ways, but in no particular order. Phillip Island, Australia, just awesome place. And the fact that it's on the island and you come through turn 2 and you're looking at the ocean. Way cool. Spa, because Spa.
Yeah, say no more.
And North America, Mosport, Canadian Tire Motorsport Park. It is the fastest, how do I put this politically correct? You have to be pretty brave to get around that track. And when you put a lap together there, you go home going, man, I did my job today.
Awesome. Well, I hope our listeners are taking notes. And last question, and maybe it's a bit of a cheeky one, but what for you is the greatest myth in performance driving that you've come across?
Wow. I just finished writing an article about that, and there was a long list of myths. Can I pick 2?
Of course. So
the first one would be that the best drivers in the world are just more naturally talented. I think it's the case of every athlete in the world. It's amazing how those naturally talented athletes seem to work harder at it, at developing their talent than anybody else does. The best race drivers I know, I'm not saying they weren't born with something special, but I think the thing that they're born with that's really special is the work ethic to want to improve, constantly improve. And I think that's the biggest thing. I have seen so many naturally talented young drivers who think that they're going to make it on natural talent, and they don't. So it's not only a myth, but it's a sad thing because there's a lot of opportunity that was missed. So I'd say that was the very first one. The second one is late braking. Late braking is going to win all the races. No, it's not. It's what you do at the end of the brake zone with how you release the brake pedal and how you manage the car entering a corner. That's what makes the biggest difference.
Well, there we are. And I'm sure there's much more of that in your books and articles. And I'm looking forward to reading that article. So Ross, we're up on time now. So I'd just like to thank you so much for such a wonderful interview.
My pleasure. Anytime that I get to talk about driving and coaching, I'm there.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
The Apex is powered by Custodian, a new platform for car enthusiasts designed to help you manage your car from anywhere. Using the latest technology, it takes the pain out of ownership and lets you just enjoy the drive, because Custodian will take care of the rest. So if you believe life starts after 6,000 RPM, you need to be on Custodian. Join us now at www.custodian.club to sign up for early access and get ready to enjoy your car like never before.